The Borough Lending Library of Flaxborough had for generations been a model of quiet efficiency. Its red brick facade, softened by soot and ivy, looked out upon the market square with the same stolid patience as the Corn Exchange and the Methodist Chapel. Inside, the odour of pasteboard, ink and floor polish created the sense of a place immune to the trivialities of change. It was therefore not considered the sort of institution where anything in the nature of a disturbance might occur. Mrs. Daisy Harbottle, the senior assistant, had spent her entire career ensuring as much. With spectacles hanging low on her nose and a voice that suggested mild but perpetual disapproval, she kept the catalogue cards in order, the borrowers silent, and the local historians suitably awed by her whispered authority. On a Thursday morning in March, however, the tranquillity of the library was ever so slightly cracked. Not shattered, nothing so vulgar as that, but cracked, in the way a teacup might show a line beneath its glaze troubling, yet not immediately catastrophic. The crack was first perceived by Mrs. Harbottle herself, though she did not immediately acknowledge it. She was reshelving an improbable quantity of romances returned by Miss Spragg, the grocer's daughter, when she noticed that an entire shelf in the local reference section was thinner than it ought to have been. A half-dozen volumes were missing. She checked her lending ledger. Nothing had been signed out, nor could she suppose without gross improbability that the Borough Directory of 1923 or Flaxborough Water Board Minutes, 1907 to 1912, had suddenly been devoured overnight by the town's youth. She pursed her lips, replaced the baronetage of Lincolnshire with unnecessary firmness, and decided she would check again after tea. Yet by mid-afternoon, a little ripple had already gone out from the library and found its way into the broader waters of Flaxborough life. Mr. Ezra Phipps, who habitually occupied a corner table to copy passages from theological journals into a notebook of his own devising, happened to see the empty gap on the reference shelf. By the time he stumbled back to his tobacconist's counter that evening, the story had enlarged itself. According to his account, there had been a raid of sorts on the borough library, and important civic records were vanished under suspicious circumstances. By closing time, 3 shopkeepers, 1 councillor, and the entire staff of the Flaxborough Citizen were aware that something untoward had happened in the sedate reading room. The following morning, Inspector Purbright, in his tidy but faintly outdated police office on the upper floor of the station, received a courteous note from Alderman Wagstaff. The alderman's hand was tremulous, but his sense of municipal self-importance entirely steady. "Dear Inspector, I hesitate to trouble you with what may prove trifling, yet feel bound to apprise you of a matter of potential concern. Certain documents vital to the town's civic memory are said to have disappeared from the borough library. Rumours are already afoot. Kindly see to it. Yours in public service, W. Wagstaff Auld." Purbright read the note while his Sergeant Love stood at the desk waiting to be dispatched to more ordinary duties. "Well now, Love," said the inspector mildly, folding the paper as though it were a modest item from the draper's catalogue. "What do you make of this? Stolen Water Board Minutes. Do you suppose there's a market for them in London?" Love, who had never knowingly made a joke in his life, blinked gravely. "Could be a collector, sir." "Indeed? Some scoundrel with a secret passion for sewerage rates." Purbright smiled faintly, placed the note in his in-tray and rose. Still, the alderman is right to have a look. And so, without alarm, without any public statement, and with only the faintest curiosity betrayed in the corners of his mouth, Inspector Purbright set off to the lending library. There, amid whispering shelves and startled librarians, he would begin to ask in his unfailingly polite manner why certain dull old books had suddenly become of such keen interest to someone in Flaxborough. The lending library had never before witnessed the presence of a uniformed constable, let alone the inspector himself. When Purbright arrived late that morning, he might as well have been stepping into a chapel service midway through the sermon. The small handful of readers looked up with that blend of indignation and curiosity, reserved for the intrusion of policemen into civilized places. Mrs. Harbottle, lips compressed, escorted him to the reference shelves with the solemnity of a verger leading a bishop. 6 volumes, she whispered, as though the word itself might disturb the remaining books. Uncatalogued, unrequisitioned, simply gone, and not the sort of thing one expects young people to tuck under their coats. Purbright inclined his head politely and peered at the shelf. The absence presented itself like a missing tooth, but he did not comment. Instead, he asked to see the lending ledger, which Mrs. Harbottle produced with the air of one producing evidence at a trial. He turned the stiff pages, noting with amusement the neat parade of titles: How to Paint Your Bungalow, Birds of the Lincolnshire Fens, 40 Years of Town Cricket. None of the missing reference volumes had been entered. Were they consulted often, he asked? Only by the more serious-minded. Local historians, counsellors, and the occasional solicitor with pretensions. Mrs. Harbottle's tone suggested that pretension was the most common motive, certainly not borrowed for bedtime amusement. The inspector's eyes travelled along the shelf to a gap where the report of the Borough Charitable Trust's 1898 had once sat. He noted, without appearing to, a faint smudge on the wood, as though a volume had been drawn away with undue haste. He said nothing further and thanked Mrs. Harbottle, promising to make the necessary inquiries. By that evening, Flaxborough was abuzz. The town, which generally regarded crime as something that happened in Grimsby or London, took hold of the library affair with greedy satisfaction. In the snug of the Bellman's Arms, Mr. Phipps embellished his story to include a midnight burglar in a dark cloak, foiled only by the vigilance of a certain gentleman known to me but not to be named. The barmaid rolled her eyes but repeated the tale verbatim to her aunt, who happened to be the charwoman for Councillor Cribbins. Within an hour, the councillor was convinced the town's archives had been systematically ransacked by an organised gang. Meanwhile, Mrs. Fothergill, president of the Women's Guild, declared to her committee that something very sinister was afoot, quite possibly connected to the recent proposal to demolish the old almshouses. It stands to reason, she said firmly, that certain persons wish the record of their obligations quietly to vanish. The Guild murmured assent, not because they understood the obligations, but because it was gratifying to imagine them being obliterated. Even the Flaxborough Citizen, which usually contented itself with reprinting the mayor's speeches and gardening tips, dispatched its junior reporter to the library for comment. The reporter found Mrs. Harbottle impenetrable. All she would say was that the inspector has matters in hand. This small phrase, however, grew wings by the time it appeared in print. Police investigate mystery of missing records. Inspector Purbright, reading the paper at his desk the following morning, allowed himself a sigh. He had merely examined a ledger and asked 2 questions, yet in the town's imagination he was already orchestrating a grand operation. Love entered just then, holding his notebook as though it might shield him from the inspector's dry humour. "Rumours spread, sir," Love said. "Some think it's burglars, others say sabotage. Mr. Cribbins stopped me in the street to complain about the risk to public confidence." Purbright folded the newspaper. "Public confidence, Love, is a delicate blossom. It flourishes in sunshine, but wilts if stared at too closely. Best not prod it too much." He asked his sergeant to make discreet calls at the solicitors' offices, the council chamber, and the historical society to determine who had used the reference section most recently. While Love set off with his patient tread, Purbright strolled out into the square, where he soon found himself intercepted by Alderman Wagstaff. The alderman, stout, rosy-cheeked, and fond of buttoning his overcoat as if for battle, expressed relief that the inspector was taking matters seriously. He hinted, with a significant cough, that certain records might relate to sensitive financial arrangements from earlier decades. When pressed, however, he waved the matter away. "Best not to rake up old ashes, Inspector, just so long as the culprits are brought to heel." Purbright nodded courteously, though inwardly he wondered what sort of ashes the alderman preferred to keep undisturbed. He continued his walk and observed, with mild detachment, how the townsfolk already carried themselves with a new importance. Flaxborough was never happier than when it could consider itself the stage for drama. At the draper's shop, 2 ladies discussed the affair with theatrical whispers, insisting the missing books must contain proof of an illegitimate will. At the post office, the clerk confided that he had always suspected foreign agents might one day target the borough's archives. At the hairdresser's, Miss Partridge solemnly informed her client that the missing volumes were undoubtedly connected to the goings-on in the gas board 20 years ago. By the time Sergeant Love returned to the station, he had collected not facts but opinions, each more colourful than the last. He reported dutifully that the solicitors had no recent use for the missing items, the council clerk denied all knowledge, and the Historical Society president was more concerned about moths in the minutes of 1885. "Quite the festival of theories," Purbright remarked. He tapped his fingers on the desk, thinking not of conspiracies but of the trivial nature of the loss. If someone wanted those volumes, the reason would likely be human rather than dramatic, something to do with vanity, embarrassment, or the convenient blotting out of a past indiscretion. The inspector, in his patient way, did not rush to identify a suspect. Instead, he allowed the town to talk itself into a froth, knowing that people who gossiped often revealed more in their eagerness to speculate than in their official statements. What mattered to him was not the noise, but the little silences, the hesitations, the cautious omissions. That evening, while the town relished its newfound scandal, Purbright wrote a short note to himself, inquire discreetly into trust records of 1890 possible sensitivities among councillors, check library closing routine, observe who shows excessive interest. He placed the note in his drawer as unobtrusive as a librarian's stamp and settled on paperwork. Outside, the lamps of Market Square glowed faintly in the mist, while behind closed doors, Flaxborough's citizens speculated, embroidered and exaggerated. By the next morning, everyone would be an expert on the missing library books except, perhaps, the one who knew exactly why they were missing. Inspector Purbright had long since learned that the surest way to discover anything in Flaxborough was not to thunder at its inhabitants, but to sit quietly while they filled a silence. He began his inquiries the following morning with the patience of a man who knew that small towns yielded their truths as slowly as butter sliding off a cool knife. He returned first to the library, this time without Sergeant Love, and asked Mrs. Harbottle whether she might be so kind as to recount who had visited the reference section during the past week. She received the request as though it were both an honour and a challenge. With a pinched smile, she adjusted her spectacles and began, in tones that conveyed both accuracy and faint moral judgment, to list the names. There was Mr. Phipps, of course, as regular as the rain. He consults theological periodicals, though one suspects he copies them without understanding. Councillor Cribbins came in on Tuesday. He asked particularly for the 1923 directory, but left when told it was unavailable. And Miss Spragg, though her interest was not scholarly, merely romantic novels. She strayed near the reference shelf only because I was replacing the baronetage, and she thought it looked exciting. Purbright, with courteous nods, allowed the litany to continue. There were 2 schoolboys whom Mrs. Harbottle had sternly reproved for whispering, a solicitor's clerk who had asked to see the trust reports but, being told they were for reference only, had muttered darkly about bureaucracy, and finally Mrs. Fothergill, who had borrowed nothing but lingered long enough to examine civic history, by which phrase Mrs. Harbottle clearly meant to suggest Snoop. When the recital concluded, Purbright thanked her and said mildly, "And the staff themselves. Do you and your assistants lock the shelves at night?" Mrs. Harbottle stiffened. "Inspector, I have been in charge of this library for 23 years. Nothing leaves without my knowledge." He apologised with an inclination of the head, and took his leave, content that the slight flush in her cheeks would remind her of the need for vigilance without causing resentment. His next stop was the tobacconist's shop, where Mr. Phipps sat perched behind the counter like an anxious bird. He received the inspector's greeting with nervous eagerness and offered him a chair beside the jars of pipe tobacco. "Awful business, Inspector. Dreadful," he began. "One cannot underestimate the gravity. These documents are not mere books, you know. They are records of our borough's soul. Without them, posterity may never know how its sewers were constructed or who paid for the town bandstand." Purbright listened gravely, permitting the man's enthusiasm to run its course. He asked when Phipps had last consulted the missing volumes. "Oh, not recently, sir, not recently. My concerns lie more with matters ecclesiastical. Still, I may have glanced at the Waterboard minutes some years ago, purely out of curiosity, you understand." The inspector noted the hesitation, the way Phipps's eyes darted to the shelf behind him as if guilty of some private indulgence. He asked no further question, merely thanked the tobacconist for his civic concern and departed, leaving Phipps with the uneasy conviction that he had said either too much or too little. Councillor Cribbins proved less willing to be accommodating. When Purbright called at his office in the back of the insurance agency, he was met with the councillor's habitual expression of harried self-importance. Cribbins was a thin man with a perpetually moist forehead and a habit of smoothing his hair whenever awkward subjects arose. Yes, I asked about the directory," he admitted when pressed, but only because Alderman Wagstaff hinted it might contain details of former rate valuations. "Perfectly proper inquiry, Inspector. Perfectly proper." He emphasised the phrase so strongly that Purbright almost smiled. The counsellor, seeing the faint twitch at the corners of the inspector's mouth, flushed and changed subject abruptly to the need for stringent policing of the markets, which had nothing whatsoever to do with libraries. Leaving him, Purbright reflected that guilty consciences rarely declare themselves with a grand confession. More often, they leak out in evasions, in sudden diversions to unrelated matters, in the perspiration of the brow when none is warranted by the temperature. By mid-afternoon, Sergeant Love returned with a note of his own inquiries. The solicitor's clerk, one Mr. Fallowby, had admitted requesting the trust reports, for purely professional reasons, though he could not or would not specify what client's interest lay therein. Love reported that the man seemed more irritated than furtive, but Purbright knew that irritation often masked embarrassment. They spoke next with Miss Spragg, encountered in the grocer's where she was weighing sugar with reckless inattention. She blushed to be addressed by the inspector, and denied any knowledge of the missing books, explaining that she read only romances and a bit of poetry. The very idea of her carrying away the waterboard minutes was greeted with giggles. Purbright dismissed her quickly. Embarrassment of another kind would be punishment enough for the young woman, who now fancied herself suspected of felony. That evening the inspector called informally at Mrs. Fothergill's, under the pretext of returning a pamphlet she had lent to the Women's Guild meeting. She received him with the stiff courtesy of one who regarded the police as necessary but faintly improper. When asked about her presence in the library, she declared that she had merely been checking certain charitable obligations. Pressed further, she pursed her lips and confided that, in her opinion, certain counsellors had much to lose if the past was scrutinised too closely. Purbright thanked her, made no comment, and withdrew. As he walked back along the high street, he considered the tone of her voice not indignant, as one might expect from a reformer, but satisfied, as though the loss of the record somehow confirmed her suspicions. People, he reflected, often treasured mysteries that validated their prejudices more than they treasured facts that dispelled them. The day's conversations had not yet produced clarity, but they had given him a map of tensions, counsellors anxious, about finances, solicitors sniffing after trusts, moral guardians eager for scandal, and townsfolk ready to embroider anything into drama. Each spoke more of themselves than of the books, yet between their words lay something useful, a pattern of who had reason to hope certain histories would be forgotten. Back at the station, he sat with Love to summarise. You will notice, Love, that everyone claims indifference to the missing items, yet each contrives to mention them with peculiar emphasis. We may safely conclude they are not as trivial as their titles suggest. Love, untroubled by irony, nodded gravely. Should we put men on to search the second-hand bookshops, sir? Purbright smiled faintly. No, Love. These books are not destined for commerce. They were taken for concealment, not for sale. It is not their value in pounds that matters, but in embarrassment. He closed the notebook, leaned back in his chair, and allowed the silence of the office to settle. Somewhere among the respectable citizens of Flaxborough, someone had removed the past in order to protect the present, and if the inspector's instinct was correct, the past would not remain hidden for long. By the third day, the case of the missing library books had matured from a curiosity into a subject demanding conclusions. In Flaxborough, conclusions were rarely drawn from evidence, they were stitched together out of gossip, stitched with such confidence that even the speaker came to believe them. It was in this manner that suspicion began to circle, like a bird selecting a perch, around Councillor Cribbins. The councillor had not helped himself by protesting too much when asked about the borough directory. His explanations, flimsy, shifting and overladen with assurances of propriety, were rehearsed loudly enough to ensure that his nervousness was common knowledge by the time the story reached the snug of the Bellman's Arms. By evening, the patrons there were reciting with satisfaction that Cribbins had been at the records and that he must have something to hide. Inspector Purbright, walking past the inn that night, overheard enough through the open window to know that public opinion had selected its suspect. He smiled faintly, for he knew how fondly townsfolk clutched at the idea of an official culprit, as though it tidied away the nuisance of uncertainty. The next morning, Alderman Wagstaff paid another visit to the police station, his cheeks puffed with civic indignation. "Inspector, I trust you have matters well in hand," he began, lowering himself into the chair opposite the desk with the solemnity of one taking command. "The good name of our borough is at stake. It cannot be allowed that records of public importance disappear without accountability, and between ourselves, I cannot but suspect that Cribbin's recent conduct is far from spotless." Purbright steepled his fingers, his gaze mild. "You believe Councillor Cribbins removed the volumes?" Wagstaff coughed. "Well, let us say he is in a position to benefit. Those charitable trust accounts why his grandfather was treasurer in the very year concerned. You see the implications." "Possibly," Purbright said. He made no note, which seemed to unsettle the alderman. Silence, delivered with politeness, was often the inspector's most effective prod. By midday, Sergeant Love returned from errands in the square with much the same report. The majority opinion now held that Cribbins had engineered the disappearance to shield family embarrassments. Love, ever conscientious, seemed troubled by the certainty with which townsfolk spoke. "They're quite fixed on him, sir. Some even say he confessed to you, though I know he didn't." Purbright regarded him thoughtfully. "It is an old habit of communities, Love, to arrange the facts so they resemble the drama they wish to see. Cribbins does sweat excessively, and sweating is nearly as good as guilt for some people's purposes." The inspector nevertheless called once more on Councillor Cribbins that afternoon. He found him at his desk, fiddling with papers in a manner that betrayed both nervousness and boredom. Councillor Purbright said gently, "It has been suggested you had particular reason to consult the trust reports of 1898. Cribbins's hands paused, then fluttered like trapped birds. "Sheer curiosity, Inspector. Nothing more. One hears things, rumours of impropriety in years past. A conscientious councillor must keep himself informed. That is all." Purbright nodded slowly, watching the man's face. He noted the perspiration beading at his temples and the frantic smoothing of hair, but also the lack of calculation. Cribbins was afraid, yes, but in the vague, unfocused way of a man who fears being thought guilty, rather than a man who has committed guilt. The inspector thanked him and departed without offering reassurance, knowing the absence of comfort would foment further nervousness. That evening, over his modest supper, Purbright considered the way the town had aligned itself against Cribbins. He weighed the councillor's eagerness to consult the records against his incoherent excuses, but still, something in the balance felt wrong. If Cribbins had taken the books to conceal family blemishes, he would have done so clumsily indeed, for he had practically advertised his interest in them to every librarian within earshot. Concealment usually involved silence, not loud insistence on one's innocence. Meanwhile, the Citizen produced another article, this one with a headline so certain it might have been written by the jury foreman in advance counsellor, linked to library loss. The text contained no evidence, only a series of leading questions and coy phrases such as it has been alleged and sources suggest. But in Flaxborough, print was taken as proof. By the time Purbright walked to the station the next morning, he passed at least 2 citizens who muttered shame as Cribbins hurried along the opposite pavement. Love, with his usual gravity, asked whether they ought to bring the councillor in for questioning. Purbright shook his head. "No, Love. To do so would only reward the appetite of gossip. We must allow the stew to simmer a little longer. If he is guilty, he will cook for himself. If not, someone else will grow careless in the heat." Throughout that day, Purbright conducted a series of small, unhurried conversations. He spoke again with the solicitor's clerk, noting the man's irritation now edged with apprehension with Mrs. Harbottle, who reported indignantly that the Women's Guild were treating the library like a crime scene, and with Miss Partridge the hairdresser, whose latest theory involved a foreign prince concealing a scandal in the borough's past. The inspector asked no searching questions. He merely listened, observing which names were mentioned too readily, which facts were embroidered, which accusations were delivered with relish rather than reluctance. From such embroidery, he knew, the outline of the truth would eventually appear. That evening, while Love shuffled reports, Purbright gazed at the grey mist beyond the station window. He reflected, as he often did, on how small-town crime differed from the brutalities elsewhere. In Flaxborough, people rarely stole for riches, they stole for pride, or to bury embarrassment, or simply to keep the narrative of their lives as neat as the ledgers in which they longed to appear respectable. Cribbins, with his damp forehead and stammering denials, fit neatly into the town's desire for a villain. Yet Purbright could not persuade himself that he fit into the reality of the crime. The councillor's flaws were those of bluster and weakness, not of calculated theft. And so, while the town settled into certainty, Inspector Purbright remained politely uncertain. He sharpened his pencil, wrote a small note to himself, observe again the solicitor's interest, looked for trivial irregularities in the closing routine and closed his notebook. The time would come when certainty would be required, but not yet. For now, it was enough to let the obvious suspect remain obvious to everyone except himself. On the morning after the citizen had delivered Cribbins to the court of public opinion, Inspector Purbright returned once more to the library, though not with the solemn purpose the townsfolk might have expected. He arrived quietly, as though intending no more than to borrow a modest volume on gardening, and greeted Mrs. Harbottle with his usual courteous neutrality. She, eager to demonstrate vigilance, led him at once to the reference shelves, where the gaps still yawned accusingly. Purbright, however, seemed less interested in the absence than in what remained. He bent to examine the lower shelf, where volumes on drainage and municipal regulations were stacked with the density of bricks. As he ran a fingertip along the wood, he paused over a thin streak of waxy residue. It was pale, brittle, and caught faintly in the groove of the shelf. "Candle grease?" he murmured aloud, though in a tone of idle curiosity rather than accusation. Mrs. Harbottle sniffed and declared no candles had been lit in the library for decades. The inspector said no more, but his eyes narrowed slightly, the way a man squints at a detail on a horizon that others overlook. When he straightened, he inquired casually about the library's closing routine. Did the assistants check the rooms before locking? Were the windows secure? Mrs. Harbottle, affronted by the implication of laxity, assured him that every latch was checked with ritual precision. Still, she admitted that one junior assistant, Miss Tither, had been known to grow distracted when hurrying to her evening bus. The inspector filed this away without comment. It was not that he suspected Miss Tither of theft, but rather that lapses often created opportunities, and opportunities were more revealing than intentions. Later that day, while the town continued to gnaw at Cribbins' reputation, Purbright asked Love to accompany him on a brief walk through the market square. They paused before the ironmonger's, then before the newspaper office, and finally before the Bellman's Arms. The inspector explained nothing, merely allowed his gaze to rest on the comings and goings of townsfolk. He remarked in his mildest tone, "Notice Love, how a rumour wears itself proudly like a new coat, but a fact is often carried quietly in the pocket. One must look for the bulge." Love, unaccustomed to metaphors, blinked solemnly. By late afternoon, Purbright's steps led him to the solicitor's office once again. Mr. Fallowby received him with the defensive tilt of the chin. He had grown weary of inquiries and was quick to insist that his interest in the trust reports was purely clerical. Routine inspector, nothing more. One must verify precedents when drafting deeds. Purbright asked if he had noticed anything unusual during his last visit to the library. Fallowby hesitated, then said only that the gas lamps outside had seemed oddly dim that evening, though it might have been his imagination. The inspector thanked him for his time, though he suspected the man had offered this crumb to distract from something else. It was not until later in the quiet of his office that Purbright allowed his thoughts to settle. He recalled the faint candle grease on the shelf, an anachronism in a library lit by electricity since before the war. He considered Fallowby's remark about dim lamps, the suggestion of unusual lighting, and he thought of the nervous evasions of those who ought to have little to fear. These were not yet conclusions, but they were threads, and Purbright had the patient fingers of a man willing to knot them together one by one. That evening, he made a discreet detour on his walk home. Passing the rear of the library, he examined the alley that ran beside the building. A dustbin, a drainpipe, and a low window gave evidence of recent disturbance. A scuff in the brickwork, a faint scrape on the sill. The inspector bent and saw, just below the frame, a droplet of hardened wax identical to the smear inside. Whoever had removed the volumes had done so by candlelight, perhaps after hours, perhaps when the library was otherwise dark. Purbright did not pry further. He merely straightened, nodded to himself, and continued his walk as if no more than enjoying the evening air. The following day, the town awoke to a new round of speculation. Word had spread, no one could say, how that evidence of satanic rituals had been found in the library. This invention, likely sprouting from the single word candle, grew with astonishing speed. By noon, the butcher's wife was declaring that strange chanting had been heard, while the draper was convinced the missing books contained spells. Purbright listened with quiet amusement as the story inflated itself, never offering correction. To contradict gossip in Flaxborough was to fertilise it. Instead, he returned to Mrs. Harbottle with a single, mild request. Might he see the key register for the building? She produced it, indignant but obedient. Purbright noted that the duplicate keys were held by the council officers and by the caretaker, one Mr. Liversedge. When questioned, Liversedge proved a stout, taciturn man who claimed to have noticed nothing unusual. He had been responsible for locking up on the night the books were last seen, and he insisted every window had been secure. His manner was bluff, but Purbright noticed how he avoided the inspector's eyes when speaking of candles. The inspector thanked him and departed, but his thoughts lingered. It was a trivial thing, a wax smear hardly worth the trouble of notice, yet it gnawed at the neatness of the story the town had constructed around Councillor Cribbins. People eager to believe in scandal rarely noticed the small, awkward details that refused to fit. Purbright, on the other hand, treated such details as seeds, tiny but destined to sprout if left undisturbed. That evening, while Love summarised the day's gossip now swollen with tales of Cribbins performing nocturnal rites, Purbright simply wrote in his notebook, candle wax, window scuff, duplicate keys, opportunity, not bluster. He closed the book, folded his hands and allowed the office to lapse into silence. Love, respectful as always, asked nothing further. Beyond the station, the lamps of Market Square glimmered once more in the mist, but the inspector's gaze rested on the faintest of marks in his memory, a streak of wax, trivial, irrelevant to anyone else, yet to him an oddly persistent reminder that truth in Flaxborough was rarely found where the crowd pointed, but more often where no one had thought to look. The talk of candle grease and secret rites had given Flaxborough a delicious new flavour of scandal, and the town, like a cat with cream, lapped it eagerly. Inspector Purbright, however, remained unmoved by the supernatural embroidery. He knew very well that when people invoked devils, they usually meant to disguise something as human and petty as envy or embarrassment. Still, he recognised the advantage of letting the town amuse itself while he extended his net a little wider. He began by revisiting the Guildhall, where Mrs. Fothergill presided over her committee with the authority of a headmistress. The women, all armed with knitting and opinions, were in the midst of speculating whether the library theft had been staged to prevent a forthcoming lecture on the history of the borough charities. Purbright, seated politely at the end of the table, allowed them to debate until Mrs. Fothergill declared that only cowardice could explain the disappearance of records. Cowardice, she repeated firmly, of those unwilling for their forebears' mismanagement to come to light. She glanced significantly at the mention of forebears, and the other ladies nodded sagely. Purbright thanked them, though he noticed how one member of the committee, a Mrs. Shipton, seemed unusually pale and anxious whenever the subject of trust funds was raised. He stored away her expression in his quiet ledger of details. From there, he made his way to the Historical Society, which met in a draughty room above the corn merchants. Its president, Mr. Biddles, welcomed him with wheezing enthusiasm, eager to share both theories and biscuits. According to Biddles, the missing books had been stolen by someone determined to suppress scandalous evidence of a duel fought behind the rectory in 1909. He offered this with the pride of a man unveiling a personal discovery, though Purbright doubted a duel over a vicar's daughter was of much concern to anyone outside the society's own membership. Still, in the course of the rambling conversation, Biddles mentioned that several society members had expressed keen interest in the trust reports, including one Mr. Hocknell, a retired bank manager with an unusually inquisitive streak. Purbright, concealing his satisfaction, made a note to call upon the man. Meanwhile, Sergeant Love pursued his own line of inquiry among the library staff. Miss Tither, the junior assistant, admitted with embarrassment that she had once or twice hurried her closing checks, though never to the point of negligence. She also recalled, after some thought, that on the evening before the disappearance, a gentleman she did not recognise had lingered near the reference shelves until nearly closing time. She described him as middle-aged, with a neat moustache and a grey hat pulled low. The description fitted half the men in Flaxborough, but it was more than Purbright had possessed before. That evening, as they reviewed their findings, Love asked whether they ought to bring in the caretaker, Liversedge, for further questioning. Purbright shook his head. Not yet. The trouble with caretakers is that they know too much of the ordinary business of a building. Ask them questions and they give you everything from boiler noises to drafts under the door. We must let him talk in his own time. The next day, Purbright paid a call upon Mr. Hocknell, the retired banker. Hocknell lived in a neat semi-detached house with curtains starched into stiffness. He received the inspector in a parlour that smelled faintly of furniture polish and respectability. Yet beneath the polish lay a nervous energy. When asked about his interest in the trust reports, Hocknell explained at once, and at length, that he was compiling a modest history of borough finances. Purely academic, Inspector. Purely academic, he insisted, though his hands fidgeted with the edges of his newspaper. Purbright listened without interruption, watching the man's discomfort grow as silence pressed upon him. Finally, Hocknell blurted out that certain irregularities in past accounts had always struck him as odd, though no doubt innocent. The inspector thanked him, accepted a ginger biscuit, and left him to his discomfort. He suspected that Hocknell's interest lay less in scholarship than in uncovering some morsel of scandal with which to enliven retirement. The field was widening as Purbright intended. Each new person touched by the missing volumes revealed another motive: curiosity, reputation, personal vindication, or the satisfaction of seeing others discomfited. None of these yet explained candle wax and a scuffed window ledge, but they gave shape to the landscape in which the truth must lie. On his way back to the station, Purbright encountered Miss Partridge outside her hairdressing shop. She stopped him with the eagerness of someone in possession of fresh gossip. Lowering her voice, though not enough to prevent half the street from hearing, she confided that she had seen Councillor Cribbins loitering outside the library one evening, looking ever so furtive. She mimed his posture, which amounted to no more than standing with hands in pockets. Purbright, careful not to smile, thanked her gravely and moved on. He knew the town's imagination was determined to keep Cribbins in the role of villain, no matter how flimsy the evidence. But the inspector's own gaze was already shifting. Candle grease, dim lighting, and a stranger in a grey hat hinted at something less parochial than Cribbins's sweaty evasions. That night, Purbright allowed himself one of his rare private reflections. Sitting by the window of his modest rooms, he thought of Flaxborough's appetite for scandal. Its people collected suspicions as others collected stamps, arranging them neatly and admiring the patterns they made. Yet unlike stamps, suspicions rarely held their value once exposed to daylight. His task, as he saw it, was to let the town admire its album while he quietly examined the envelope glue and the postmark. He closed his notebook with a quiet click and prepared for bed. Tomorrow, he would speak again with Liversedge, and perhaps with Miss Tither, pressing them gently for what they had not yet thought worth mentioning. For in Flaxborough, truth was often concealed not by cleverness, but by the sheer ordinariness of detail. And somewhere amid those details the smear of wax, the scuff of a shoe, the nervous glance of a clerk lay the thread that would draw the whole pattern tight. Inspector Purbright rose the next morning with a steady expectation that Flaxborough, having wrung every drop of entertainment from its missing library books, would begin to find the matter tedious. He underestimated his town. Instead of fatigue, it was rewarded with novelty. For by mid-morning a fresh disturbance had provided new life to the scandal. It was Sergeant Love who brought the news, entering the inspector's office, with a solemnity reserved for occasions that might require paperwork in duplicate. "There's been another occurrence, sir," he reported. "Caretaker Liversedge found a window forced at the Guildhall. Nothing much was taken, but some papers disturbed." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "The Women's Guild, Love? One can hardly imagine burglars desperate enough to risk themselves for embroidery patterns and hymn schedules." Love coughed politely. "True enough, sir, though Mrs. Fothergill insists something of importance may have been interfered with. She's waiting at the hall to show you." Purbright gathered his coat and hat without haste, and together they strolled across the square to the Guild building. A cluster of women lingered at the doorway, each conveying by expression that they were witnesses to an outrage. Mrs. Fothergill herself stood at the front, her bosom rising like a ship's prow as she steered the inspector inside. In the committee room, a desk stood open, its drawers rummaged. Papers lay scattered with untidy haste. "This," Mrs. Fothergill declared, pointing at a ledger, "is our Guild's record of charitable appeals. Imagine, Inspector, if such information fell into unprincipled hands, the reputations of worthy families could be traduced." Purbright examined the ledger. The pages were filled with neat accounts of donations, subscribers, and causes. One page, however, showed a tear where a leaf had been roughly removed. He closed the book gently and asked whether anyone else besides the Guild officers held keys to the hall. Mrs. Fothergill bristled. Certainly not. though the caretaker, of course, has access. Love inspected the window, noting the scrape of a lever against the frame. It had been forced crudely, though not with a burglar's efficiency. Purbright bent to pick up a fragment from the floor corner of stiff paper, faintly browned, with a margin note in careful copperplate. It seemed to belong to a document older than the guild's ledger. He pocketed it discreetly, murmuring only that it might have fallen by chance. As they left, Mrs. Fothergill insisted that this incident proved her earlier suspicions someone was intent on concealing shameful histories. The inspector agreed politely, though without endorsement. On the walk back to the station, Love ventured, "Looks like the same hand, sir. Whoever wanted the library records may be after other papers now." "Perhaps," Purbright said mildly. "Or perhaps Flaxborough is more full of secrets than we supposed, and someone has developed a taste for tidying them away." That afternoon, rumours galloped ahead of facts. By tea-time, the town had woven the Guildhall breaking into the existing tale, declaring it a continuation of Councillor Cribbins's alleged cover-up. The poor man, already hounded by whispers, now found himself accused of rifling drawers in the dead of night. Purbright, observing him from across the street, saw a man shrivel beneath suspicion, though still protesting his innocence to any who would listen. The inspector, however, was occupied with the fragment of paper recovered from the Guildhall. Under lamplight he examined its faded script. It appeared to belong to a 19th century deed or agreement, though the fragment was too small to identify precisely. The copperplate hand resembled those in the borough records housed at the library. He frowned slightly. Whoever had broken into the Guildhall seemed less interested in modern accounts than in historical documents, those same dull, cumbersome records others dismissed as harmless. To confirm his impression, he visited the town clerk, Mr. Mounts, who had custody of many municipal archives. Mounts, a man who regarded his papers as sacred relics, reacted with consternation when shown the fragment. "Why, Inspector, this is from the 1875 Charitable Bequests Register, but that volume has not left my office in 20 years. His hands trembled as he declared he would check at once. Purbright waited while the clerk rummaged among shelves and strongboxes. At length Mounts emerged pale, declaring that indeed one leaf from the register was missing an oddity he had not previously noticed. It concerns the Enderby Trust, a small bequest left by a merchant for the maintenance of widows. Nothing of present consequence, surely." The inspector inclined his head. "Quite possibly nothing, Mr. Mounts, yet it seems someone finds it of consequence." That evening, as the fog settled over the town, Purbright walked slowly back to the station. His mind sifted through the pattern emerging missing volumes from the library, a forced window at the Guildhall, a leaf torn from the bequests register. Each incident concerned records of charity, trust, or municipal obligation. The common thread was not value but vulnerability, the sort of thing that, if revealed, might embarrass families who had long cultivated the appearance of unblemished respectability. At his desk he shared these reflections with Love, who listened gravely. "So it's all connected, sir. Someone wants to erase the town's memory of those trusts. Perhaps, Love. But erasure often calls more attention than the record itself. It is not only the guilty who have reason to meddle. Sometimes it is the suspicious, the fearful, or even the curious. We must not too hastily assign motive." Love nodded, though his brow furrowed with effort. The town meanwhile embraced the second incident with fresh enthusiasm. By the following morning, tales of secret societies, vanished fortunes, and political conspiracies filled the air. Shopkeepers whispered, postmen lingered at gates, and children dared one another to peek through the library windows after dark. Purbright, for his part, made no attempt to suppress the speculation. He let the current run, knowing it would eventually drag someone farther than they intended. It was during his customary evening walk that he paused once more beside the library's rear alley. The faint scrape on the sill seemed almost to echo the lever marks found at the Guildhall. Two separate disturbances, similar in method, both aimed at dusty records. He smiled to himself, not with satisfaction, but with the patient amusement of a man watching a pattern grow from scattered stitches. Flaxborough was rarely exciting, yet here it was producing a sequence of events as neat as any puzzle in a schoolchild's exercise book. All that remained was to find which citizen's nervous fingers had been holding the pencil. Inspector Purbright had long cultivated the habit of walking in the evenings, not for exercise, but for clarity. Flaxborough by lamplight was a subdued creature, the shop fronts shuttered, the cobbles glistening faintly with mist, the last buses grumbling away. It was in this stillness that he allowed the fragments of his inquiries to drift into place. The town supplied a constant clatter of gossip, each rumour laid down like a coat of paint. But the inspector knew that beneath the paint there was always a grain of wood, and it was in the grain that the truth lay. The second incident at the Guild Hall had done more than furnish another scene of disturbance. It had established a pattern. The thefts and rummagings were not indiscriminate, not the acts of boys or vagrants, but deliberate, targeted at the fragile tissue of civic memory. The missing volumes, the torn register leaf, even the candle wax each pointed not to wealth, but to reputation. Purbright reflected that reputations in Flaxborough were as jealously guarded as family silver, and just as easily tarnished. He thought of Councillor Cribbins. Sweating under suspicion, he had almost been invited by his clumsy denials. Cribbins was an easy target, the sort of man whose every gesture seemed to plead guilty to something. Yet Purbright could not see him creeping into the Guildhall by night with a lever and a candle. The councillor's failings were those of vanity and nervousness, not audacity. To assume otherwise was to confuse a stammer for a confession. Then there was Fallowby, the solicitor's clerk, whose irritation had betrayed a sharper edge than mere inconvenience. Clerks, Purbright knew, often guarded their employers' secrets with exaggerated indignation. If the missing papers touched on an old case, or a trust still capable of embarrassing a client, Fallowby might well have reason to hope the documents would vanish. But irritation was not the same as initiative. A man who smouldered at bureaucracy did not necessarily risk arrest with a crowbar. Hocknell, the retired banker, was another puzzle. His curiosity about borough finances had the slightly fevered quality of a man too long retired, who sought scandal to animate his evenings. Purbright suspected that Hocknell would delight in exposing impropriety, but delight was not the same as danger. To imagine him climbing through windows in the night was almost comic, and yet such comic improbabilities had a way of turning true, especially in a town where boredom was a persistent disease. As Purbright reached the edge of the square, he turned his thoughts to Mrs. Fothergill and her guild. She, more than anyone, had seized on the disturbances as confirmation of her long-cherished belief that Flaxborough's respectable facade concealed a mire of moral decay. She had spoken of cowardice, of families unwilling to have their forebears' faults displayed. But her relish betrayed her. A true reformer might mourn such concealment. Mrs. Fothergill practically savoured it. Her guild ledger, with its missing leaf, might contain less a record of generosity than of obligation owed, promises forgotten, or names that did not bear repeating. Purbright allowed himself the smallest of sighs. The challenge, as always, was to separate those who longed for scandal from those who feared it. Too many in Flaxborough wished to embroider the mystery with their prejudices, yet the candle wax remained stubbornly without embellishment, a physical fact that no one but he had remarked. That wax was real. That scuff on the sill was real. Facts, not whispers, would eventually guide his hand. He returned to the station where Love sat tidily at his desk, completing reports in his careful script. The sergeant looked up and asked whether they were to pursue any of the names more vigorously. Purbright shook his head. Not yet, Love. To press too soon would frighten away what we need most: unguarded words. Better to let them speak of one another a little longer. As the hours deepened into night, the inspector sat with his lamp leafing through his notes. He considered the fragment from the bequests register, that small torn corner with its elegant copper plate. It was a humble thing, yet someone had risked discovery to prize it loose. Why? Not for money, certainly. The value lay in what it revealed or concealed about Flaxborough's past arrangements for widows and trusts. Perhaps the names inscribed there connected to families who still walked the streets, still nodded to one another at Sunday service, still trembled at the thought of exposure. Purbright thought, not without humour, that the crime was almost courteous in its intent. No violence, no vulgar theft of money or jewels. Instead, a tidying up of history, as though someone had taken it upon themselves to serve as the borough's discreet editor. Yet editing, he knew, could be as damning as confession. The inspector rested his pen and considered human nature. People did not change much across the years. a trust set up in 1875 to support widows might, by 1898, have become a convenient purse for someone's personal comfort. A family that once benefited improperly might dread the record's survival. Their descendants, outwardly respectable, might feel that dread still, and so the crime was not only against paper but against time itself, against the persistence of memory. Purbright reflected that in small towns, memory was more feared than crime. Theft could be repaid. Scandal could not be erased. He closed his notebook and allowed the quiet to settle around him. Love, respectful of the inspector's silences, said nothing further. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a cat wishing to be let in. In that stillness, Purbright knew that the investigation had reached its turning point. The town had played its part with rumours and suspicions, but he must now begin to test people against the pattern he saw emerging. Candle wax, a scuffed window, a torn page, a nervous glance, each small, each trivial, yet together composing a melody of concealment. The time was nearing when a single polite question, placed with precision, might cause the tune to falter. For now, though, he allowed himself the comfort of patience. The guilty in Flaxborough rarely ran. They lingered among their neighbours, certain that the respectability of their lives was armour enough, and that certainty, Purbright knew, was the crack into which truth would quietly pour. Inspector Purbright was never one for dramatic gestures. He disliked corners, ultimatums, and the clang of handcuffs in polite settings. His method was gentler, more like placing a teacup at the edge of a table and waiting to see who rushed to steady it. In the wake of the Guildhall disturbance and the town's rising hysteria, he decided the time had come to set such a cup wobbling. He began not with Councillor Cribbins, who was already buckling under suspicion, but with Mr. Hocknell, the retired banker. Purbright invited him to the station under the guise of consultation, greeting him with such courtesy that Hocknell, flattered, scarcely noticed the subtle tightening of questions. The inspector remarked on the candle wax found near the library shelves, then allowed silence to stretch, as though awaiting an explanation. Hocknell shifted uneasily in his chair, his fingers drumming on his umbrella handle. "I can assure you, Inspector, I have no use for candles. I have proper lamps at home, you know." He laughed weakly, the sound collapsing under its own nervousness. Purbright smiled kindly and changed subject at once, noting the man's relief with quiet satisfaction. The purpose had been served. Hocknell had revealed a guilty anxiety, though whether of action or simply of imagination remained to be seen. Later that afternoon, the inspector arranged an informal visit with Fallowby, the solicitor's clerk. Over tea in the man's lodgings, Purbright spoke lightly of the missing trust reports, observing that old bequests often contained surprises. He remarked, almost as an aside, that certain names from the Enderby Trust had recently come under scrutiny. Fallowby's cup rattled against its saucer before he set it down with forced calm. "Old names, Inspector, quite irrelevant today. Surely no one troubles themselves with century-old obligations." Purbright inclined his head. "One would think not, Mr. Fallowby. And yet people are curiously sensitive about paper. I find it telling how often embarrassment is preserved more faithfully than generosity." The remark hung in the air while Fallowby stared at the teapot, as though it might provide an alibi. The inspector took his leave soon after, convinced the man was concealing knowledge, though not necessarily guilty of the actual break-ins. That evening he allowed himself a small experiment in public theatre. At the Bellman's Arms, before an attentive crowd eager for any morsel, he mentioned in passing that the police now have an excellent idea of the method employed to gain entry. He elaborated no further, but the suggestion alone was enough. The next day, whispers circulated that the inspector had fingerprints, or photographs, or perhaps even a confession. Purbright knew this would unsettle whoever was truly involved. A guilty person in Flaxborough, convinced that discovery was imminent, was far more likely to betray themselves by hasty words than by material evidence. The town, he reflected, was a stage on which panic was a louder actor than cunning. Sure enough, by midweek, Mrs. Shipton of the Guild Committee called at the station flustered and trembling. She insisted she had nothing to do with missing papers, but wished the inspector to know that Mrs. Fothergill kept certain old records locked away privately for the Guild's dignity. She said this with the air of someone delivering revelation, though Purbright recognised it as more of a defence by accusing another. She sought to preempt suspicion of herself. He thanked her gently and allowed her to depart lighter of conscience but heavier in the inspector's mental ledger. The true test, however, came in the form of a simple letter. Purbright drafted it in his careful hand and delivered it discreetly to each of the principal figures. Cribbins, Hocknell, Fallowby, Mrs. Fothergill each received a polite note stating that the police had recovered a small fragment of a document believed to be from the Enderby Trust records and requesting their comments at their convenience. He knew the innocent would shrug, the guilty, however, would itch at the thought of what that fragment contained. Within hours the effects began to ripple. Cribbins arrived at the station in a state of agitation, demanding to know whether his family's name was compromised. His forehead gleamed with perspiration, but Purbright, watching him flounder, grew more certain than ever that his guilt was limited to vanity. A man so desperate for reassurance would never have risked the act that caused the scandal. Hocknell sent no reply at all, an omission the inspector found curiously eloquent. Fallowby responded with a terse note insisting that nothing in the Enderby Trust could be of modern consequence, a phrase so defensive it practically underlined itself, and Mrs. Fothergill, undaunted, called in person to declare triumphantly that at last the guilty would be exposed, whoever they were. Purbright listened with mild courtesy, though her relish only confirmed his suspicion that she preferred scandal discovered rather than concealed. That night the inspector reviewed the reactions in his notebook, setting them down as neatly as sums. One man overeager, another silent, a third too emphatic, a woman triumphant. 4 variations on anxiety, each telling in its own way. He tapped his pencil thoughtfully, reflecting how in Flaxborough guilt was never as revealing as fear. When Love asked quietly if they were near to an arrest, Purbright smiled faintly. Nearer, perhaps, but arrests are like harvests, Love. Best not to reap too soon. The grain fattens if left to stand a little longer. The sergeant, taking this as literal agricultural advice, merely nodded. Purbright extinguished his lamp and sat in the stillness of the office, considering the picture. The thefts were not desperate acts of criminals, but careful, almost surgical removals of records whose embarrassment outlived their relevance. Someone in Flaxborough was tidying away the past with a candle and a crowbar, convinced that secrecy could preserve reputation. The inspector knew otherwise. The act of concealment was itself a confession, and his quiet prods had already begun to unravel the composure of those most anxious. Soon, with one more gentle touch, the teacup would topple, and the guilty hand would betray itself. The day after Purbright's letters had been delivered, Flaxborough stirred with nervous anticipation. The town could not have articulated what it expected to happen, but it was certain that something momentous was about to be revealed. In the snug of the Bellman's Arms, theories collided like billiard balls in the post office queue. Whispers were exchanged more quickly than stamps. Even the vicar's wife remarked that the inspector's silence of late surely indicated he was preparing a dramatic announcement. Purbright, of course, was doing nothing of the kind. He went about his usual business with such composure that Sergeant Love privately wondered whether the inspector had grown indifferent to the whole matter. In reality, Purbright had merely chosen his moment, and was allowing the guilty nerves to fray a little further. It was Mrs. Shipton, the timid guild member, who unwittingly provided the final stitch. She appeared at the station, twisting her gloves, to confide that she had overheard Mrs. Fothergill speaking sharply to Mr. Hocknell at a guild meeting. The words had been indistinct, but Shipton swore she caught the phrase "those names must never be known." Her delivery was breathless, as if she had betrayed not merely a confidence but a conspiracy. Purbright received this without visible reaction, but later, in the quiet of his office, he reflected on how the threads aligned. The missing library volumes, the torn leaf from the bequests register, the intrusion at the guild hall all circled back to the same kernel, the Enderby Trust and its successors. The trust, a seemingly obscure bequest, had clearly been mismanaged, perhaps diverted in decades past. Those who benefited, or their descendants, now walked the streets in respectable guise, and among them one had decided the surest protection was not silence, but obliteration of the record. The inspector arranged a meeting in the council chamber under the polite pretext of clarifying matters. He invited Councillor Cribbins, Mr. Hocknell, Mr. Fallowby, and Mrs. Fothergill, along with Alderman Wagstaff, whose sense of civic gravity would lend the gathering legitimacy. They assembled with varying degrees of reluctance and pride, each secretly convinced the inspector's revelations would clear them and condemn another. Purbright opened the meeting with his customary mildness, thanking them for their attendance. He spoke not of burglaries or break-ins, but of the importance of maintaining trust in our borough's records. He laid on the table the fragment of paper from the bequests register, letting it rest there like an unspoken accusation. "You will recognise," he said gently, "that this fragment belongs to a leaf torn from the register of 1875. That page listed the original beneficiaries of the Enderby Trust. Its removal, like the disappearance of certain later records, was no accident. Someone here wished to prevent the past from intruding upon the present. There was a shifting of feet, a clearing of throats. Cribbins dabbed at his forehead. Hocknell clutched his umbrella. Fallowby stared hard at the floor, and Mrs. Fothergill, eyes shining, looked around with theatrical expectancy, as though rehearsing the moment of unmasking. Purbright let the silence grow before he continued. The method employed was crude but consistent entry forced by lever, concealment by candlelight, selective removal of documents. It was not a boyish prank, nor an outsider's burglary. It was the work of someone who knew exactly what they sought. Hocknell muttered something about scholarly interest, but Purbright raised a hand gently. "No, Mr. Hocknell. Scholarship desires preservation, not destruction. What we have here is the opposite. Pages removed, volumes concealed, all pointing to an intent not to study history but to erase it." His gaze moved slowly across the table. "The question is whose history?" Mrs. Fothergill drew herself up. "Surely, Inspector, you do not suggest that any of us I do," Purbright interrupted softly. His tone was not sharp, but its finality hushed her at once. "The Guildhall breaking was not an attack on your dignity, Mrs. Fothergill. It was a continuation of the same process begun at the library. And when I mentioned in my letters that a fragment of the trust register had been recovered, one of you reacted with such silence that it spoke louder than words." He turned his gaze towards Hocknell. The banker's hands twitched on his umbrella. There had nothing to Purbright's voice was calm, almost pitying. "Mr. Hocknell, the Enderby Trust was administered, in its later years, by your own bank. Misallocations occurred, small sums, perhaps, at first, diverted in ways that might seem harmless. But the records remained, and you, in your retirement, found yourself haunted by the knowledge that those old volumes might one day betray both your institution and, by extension, your name." There was a stir around the table. Cribbins looked startled. As though reprieved, Fallowby sat rigid, his indignation suppressed by surprise. Mrs. Fothergill's expression betrayed a keen disappointment that she herself was not the hero of the revelation. Purbright continued gently. "You visited the library under pretext of research, lingered after closing, and returned later with a duplicate key borrowed from the caretaker under some casual excuse. The candle wax betrayed you. A banker thinks in ledgers, Mr. Hocknell, but candles leave marks outside of them." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Hocknell's laboured breathing. At last he stammered. It was not theft, it was a correction. Mere correction of errors that should never have been preserved. No good could come of stirring them again. What would people think after all these years? Purbright inclined his head, his voice still courteous. "They would think, perhaps, that you were human. But by your actions, you have convinced them otherwise. Concealment has only sharpened suspicion, and suspicion, once fed, grows into certainty." Hocknell sagged in his chair, the umbrella slipping from his grasp. No one spoke. The room's air carried not triumph but the faint chill of anticlimax. For in Flaxborough, revelations were rarely explosive. They were quiet, inevitable, and faintly disappointing, like rain on a long-expected picnic. Purbright closed the register fragment, folded it into his notebook, and rose. "There will be formalities, of course, but for now let us agree that the borough's memory must remain intact, however inconvenient. Paper may be, embarrassing, but its absence is accused." With that he offered a small bow of courtesy and departed, leaving behind a group of citizens suddenly smaller in their own estimation. Outside, the mist hung low over the square, and the inspector, walking home, reflected that in Flaxborough justice was never dramatic. It was merely tidy, and tidiness, to him, was satisfaction enough. By the following morning, Flaxborough had already adjusted itself to the revelation with the resilience peculiar to small towns. Nobody admitted to having been surprised, though everyone claimed to have suspected Mr. Hocknell all along. The tobacconist Phipps, with a solemn nod, informed his customers that he had noticed peculiar behaviour for years. Miss Partridge of the hairdresser repeated with satisfaction that she had always said bankers were shifty, and Mrs. Fothergill, speaking with tragic grandeur, declared that the guild had been vindicated, though she offered no detail as to how. Councillor Cribbins, much relieved to be freed from suspicion, went about town with new vigour, his forehead shining now with pride rather than anxiety. He spoke at length to anyone who would listen about the importance of transparency in public affairs, conveniently forgetting how recently he had been most eager to avoid it. Fallowby, the solicitor's clerk, adopted a knowing air and hinted that he had advised caution from the beginning. Hocknell himself withdrew into his house, curtains drawn, visitors denied. The town, having feasted on him, found little appetite for further cruelty. He had not stolen money, after all only dignity, and that was a currency Flaxborough dealt in every day. What lingered was not outrage, but a faint disappointment that the mystery had resolved itself into something so ordinary. A man afraid of old records, paper and ink wielding more terror than knives or masks. Inspector Purbright, for his part, made no public statement. He completed the necessary paperwork with his usual neatness, phrasing the account so that embarrassment was acknowledged but not exaggerated. He knew that scandal, once embalmed in official reports, tended to outlive its usefulness. Better to let the town absorb it in its own way, through gossip that softened into anecdote and finally into folklore. In his office, Sergeant Love asked whether the case had truly ended. Purbright, looking over his spectacles, replied gently, "Cases end, Love, when people tire of them. The law can only draw a line. Human nature must do the rest." He placed the last report in his drawer and closed it with a click. The town soon returned to its rhythms. The library resumed its silence, Mrs. Harbottle once more policing whispers with relish. The Guild Committee drafted a resolution calling for greater vigilance in the custody of records, though half the members could not recall precisely which records were meant. The Citizen produced a final headline, "Mystery of Borough Papers," resolved before retreating to the safer ground of market prices and gardening advice. For Purbright, there was no sense of triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of order restored. He had, as always, allowed people to speak themselves into revelation, observed what they overlooked and nudged where necessary. The candle grease, the scuffed window, the fragment of paper trifles, yet enough to unravel a scheme rooted not in malice, but in the ordinary fear of discovery. That evening, as he sat at his desk, he reflected briefly on Flaxborough's peculiar genius for drama. It would never produce great crimes, only small ones dressed in importance. But those small crimes revealed more of human nature than the grand gestures ever could: vanity, insecurity, the desperate wish to appear better than one was. And in a town so fond of its own respectability, those traits were crimes enough. He sharpened his pencil, straightened the papers before him, and resumed his paperwork with unhurried composure. Outside, the square was settling into evening quiet, the lamps glowing steadily against the mist. Flaxborough, chastened but comforted, carried on as though nothing had happened. And Inspector Purbright, patient, observant, and faintly amused, carried on as though everything had.